When people talk about Batman the Brave and the Bold, they usually mention the tone, the bright colours, and its humour. If they're especially engaged with the source material, you may even hear how it leans into an older version of the character that modern Batman stories often leave behind. And there's a character that this show created who I think really exemplifies that older take on Batman, and that's Proto, the prototype Bat-Bot. He first appeared in the episode The Plague of the Prototypes, which features Batman dealing with rogue technology, a threat to destroy Gotham, and invaders from outer space. But that's not really what this episode is about, no. I want to talk about how The Brave and the Bold treats Batman's past as something worth keeping alive, and at the centre of that is Adam West and his role as Proto. I'm sure that by now most people are aware that Adam West's main claim to fame is his role as Batman in the 60s TV series. That show took the world by storm very briefly and really defined the character for decades in the public's consciousness. And casting Adam West as Proto wasn't just a novelty cameo or a wink to the audience. It actually does a lot of the real narrative work. When Proto speaks, the episode tells you what kind of values it's engaging with and which version of Batman it's drawing from. But before getting to that, let's first briefly recap Proto's story. So in terms of what happens in the episode, while Batman deals with aliens trying to bypass Earth's defences, he leaves Gotham under the protection of his fleet of advanced Bat-Bots. They are essentially robotic versions of himself that patrol Gotham while he's not around. When Black Mask and his gang carry out a series of robberies, those same Bat-Bots are eventually hijacked and turned into weapons that Black Mask intends to use to destroy half of Gotham. Running parallel to that crisis is Proto Bat-Bot, an earlier oversized prototype from back when Batman thought bigger would be better, kept in the Batcave largely because Ace the Bat-Hound likes him. He is enthusiastic about justice, but he's clumsy and inexperienced. He also refers to himself in the third person, indicating that his mind isn't fully developed. He's desperate to get out of the cave and fight crime because that was his intended purpose. But the problem is, for as enthusiastic as he is, he can't be trusted. And it's not because he's malicious, but because he's impractical and potentially dangerous. When the Bat-Bots turn on Batman, trapping him inside the Batmobile and setting him on fire, Proto ignores his restrictions and rescues Batman. When Batman agrees to let Proto help him, he immediately begins to question that decision after Proto knocks the sign off of a bank. Now, a significant point is that while Proto may be clumsy and causes a lot of collateral damage, he understands the sanctity of life, and this is best represented when he sees a kitten perilously hanging from a fire escape. Despite Batman's objections, Proto leaps into action and catches the kitten. Sure, he wrecks the fire escape in the process, but the kitten is unharmed. So Batman tells Proto to imagine that every civilian is a delicate little kitten in need of his protection. With that distinction made, Proto becomes very useful, utilising his size to intimidate Black Mask's henchman Taboo into telling them where the bombs are. And once he activates his War on Evil mode, his style changes from a friendly giant to a more Frank Miller-like rectangular Batman who means business. He ultimately carries the final explosive Bat-Bot into the sky, survives the detonation and confirms what we already knew, that he is a real hero. Recognizing that Proto doesn't belong in Gotham, Batman sends him into space where he can be his best self. It is ultimately a heartwarming story, but I think it also says a lot about who Batman is and the character's history. Proto reflects what The Brave and the Bold was doing as a whole. He's outdated, overly sincere, and wildly impractical in a modern city, but his values are never in question. That's ultimately what the show as a whole was exploring with Batman himself. It acknowledges that older versions of the character don't always fit neatly into the present, but it never treats them as mistakes that need to be erased. It's important to remember that in 2008, when Batman the Brave and the Bold first aired, Batman had already spent almost 20 years defined by darkness, realism and psychological weight in mainstream media. Instead of pushing further in that direction, the series made a conscious decision to include some of the light-hearted elements from Batman's history. The show isn't embarrassed by the Silver Age, and it isn't trying to apologise for it. It treats that era as a legitimate part of Batman's identity, a time when stories were bold, moral lines were clear, and heroism was uncomplicated. That influence shows up everywhere. The visual design is cleaner and brighter, the conflicts are larger than life, There are good guys and there are bad guys, with very little room in between. Even danger is framed in a way that allows for optimism. And a crucial distinction to make is that The Brave and the Bold doesn't argue that this version of Batman is better than modern interpretations. The series positions itself as one branch of a much larger tradition, not a replacement for anything that came before or after. That context is important because without it, Proto might feel like a joke, as if they were mocking what had come before. But within The Brave and the Bold, he feels like a continuation, and I would argue that no piece of casting makes this clearer than Adam West. He wasn't just another actor who had played Batman for many people, he was Batman, in much the same way that Kevin Conroy is Batman for people of my age. In Batman the Animated Series, West voiced the Grey Ghost, an actor whose old television adventures inspired Bruce Wayne as a child. That role directly acknowledges Batman's debt to earlier, more straightforward forms of heroism. The episode wasn't about replacing the past, but recognizing its influence. The Grey Ghost was used to show that Batman came from somewhere. It may have been a one-and-done role, but it was memorable and effective. In the next Batman show, The Batman, West appeared as Mayor Grange, and it's a smaller part, true, but it's a telling one. He becomes a voice of civic authority rather than costumed heroism, representing order and responsibility in a world that still needs protection. Once again, he isn't treated as a joke or a relic, but as a stabilizing presence. Taken together, those roles show a pattern. Adam West is consistently used in Batman media to embody legacy, inspiration, and continuity. By the time he voices Proto Bat-Bot in The Brave and the Bold, that meaning is already established. His voice doesn't just recall an older version of Batman, it carries the idea that Batman's past still matters, and that it continues to shape the character long after the tone has changed. And it's not just his voice either, but his design. Specifically his head. Proto's head resembles the cowl of the 60s Batman, down to the friendly eyes. It's all very deliberately coded to remind us of a simpler, more hopeful time. I should also add that this wasn't West's only role in The Brave and the Bold. In Chill of the Night, he played Batman's father, Thomas Wayne, again using his voice as a shorthand for legacy. I like to think that Batman deliberately gave his prototype Bat-Bot his father's voice because he couldn't think of anyone stronger or more brave to take inspiration from, but that's never confirmed. Note that the final Bat-Bots have generic robotic voices and regurgitate quips. Proto, meanwhile, has a personality of his own, but can't quite get his lines right, referring to Batman's hammers of justice, his fists, as hammocks of justice. But West's voice does a lot of the work for Proto. We don't need a lengthy introduction to him because West's voice immediately supplies context. The audience understands Proto's values before he does anything. His politeness, his certainty, and his enthusiasm are all inherited traits. And when Proto is down on himself, saying that he's too clumsy and too stupid to be a hero, it pains us. This is why the casting matters more than any specific line of dialogue. If Proto were voiced by anyone else, there's a risk that he would read as comic relief or a failed experiment. With West, he reads as a continuation. Granted, the episode relies on the audience's familiarity with that voice to frame Proto in this way, but I think that most viewers would be aware. In this story, Proto represents an earlier plan of action that Batman ultimately decided against. His size, his formality, and his lack of subtlety marks him as a character who belongs to a simpler time. But Batman cannot bring himself to simply deactivate him. He says he keeps Proto around because Ace likes him, but that's just an excuse. It's not so much that Proto is incapable of being a hero, it's that he isn't really designed for a place like Gotham. He's just too big and too enthusiastic. For as much as Proto wishes to be a crime-stopping superhero, Batman can't ignore the fact that he will inevitably wreck the place. Even after he triumphantly returns to the ground after saving the city, he accidentally smashes the road. So Batman comes up with an elegant solution. Batman sends Proto to patrol space, defending Earth from those same aliens that masqueraded as asteroids at the start of the episode. Batman puts his size, power, and enthusiasm to good use, and reassures Ace that Proto will be coming back to Earth regularly to check in and get tuned up. Some may call it a banishment, but it's more that Batman had identified Proto's strengths and weaknesses and came up with a strategy for using them. The alternative would be to return him to the Batcave, keeping him isolated, or to just shut him down. Batman acknowledges that he is a valuable hero, and those other two options are off the table. This ending also evokes the first appearance of Krypto the Superdog in the 1950s, where his rambunctious ways caused mayhem in Smallville, so Superman sent him out into space to play fetch, ready to return at a moment's notice if he was ever needed. While Proto didn't return for a major story of his own, we did get to see him one last time in the final episode of the series, when everything drew to a close. At the end of the day, Proto Bat-Bot is memorable because of what he represents rather than what he does. The Brave and the Bold uses Proto, and by extension Adam West, as a reminder of where Batman comes from. By giving Proto that voice, the show frames nostalgia as something constructive rather than limiting, and honours the past without letting it dominate the present. Sending Proto into space is an act of trust. The idea that Batman's history is strong enough to stand on its own, and that it will always find its way back when it's needed. Okay, that's it for this essay. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really liked the video and feel like tossing a buck or two my way, please consider using the thanks button, because every little helps. And if you have really enjoyed my work, you might want to pick up a copy of my book, Rogues Gallery. It features 22 essays on villains from Batman the Animated Series. There's a beautiful cover by Batman the Animated Series background artist John Calmette, a foreword by director Dan Reber, and a moving segment from the late Kevin Conroy sharing his thoughts on life, love, and loss. Plus, an exclusive essay on the Condiment King that will never be made into a video. Rogues Gallery is available worldwide on Amazon, both digitally and in softcover. Finally, channel memberships are just $1.99 a month and give you early access to my essays, custom emojis, and your name featured on my members end screen, which has been rolling for a little while now. Huge thanks to everyone who's already part of this. You've helped to make these videos possible. If you want to see your name up here too, join the channel now. And while I have your attention, please consider checking out my other channel, Serum Lake Comics, where I talk about mostly DC comic books. Next time, I'll be back on Monday to discuss an early episode of Superman the Animated Series that took a goofy Golden Age supervillain with a toy gimmick and reimagined him as an obsessive, emotionally stunted creep. We're going to talk about the debut of Toyman in Fun and Games. And next Friday, it's time to talk about another heroic figure that made their most prominent appearance in Justice League Unlimited. Ahead of him getting his own show within the next year or so, I want to talk about Mr. Miracle. Hope to see you then.